Thank you very much, Ed, for your kind introduction. And it was just my luck that my biggest technological problems happened. Something, I think, can I just click on yes? Haha, maybe I can. Please. Oh, there it goes anyway. OK, fantastic. My biggest technological problems have to happen at Princeton, you know, at a talk sponsored by the former chief technologist or deputy chief technologist of the United States. So that's just my luck. My apologies for all of that. So I want to talk to you this afternoon a little bit about two different ways of making a difference. And you know, I had an idea when I was at the American Civil Liberties Union in about the middle half of the second term in the Bush administration that I could go inside the surveillance state and make a difference for privacy in a new kind of job. And I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. So I worked inside the intelligence community for 6 years, from 2006, 6 to 7 years, 2006 to beginning of 2013. And my job was to design privacy safeguards for NSA mass surveillance programs. And I didn't have the ability to talk about most of what I worked on because it was highly classified. So that was my strategy, was to work within the system using the existing oversight rules and mechanisms and to try to adapt them for our digital age. Now, another fellow had a different idea about how to make a difference. And he worked in the intelligence community for roughly the same period of time. We kind of started within months of each other, and I actually signed my paperwork leaving the government 2 days prior to when the world found out about Ed Snowden. So his idea was to blow it up with a series of massive and damaging leaks. So I always like looking at the issue of results. You know, if you're looking at two different ways of doing anything, the scientific approach is to say, how did it do? How did it work out? So here were my results from 6 years of working within the system. And I'm proud of these. I think actually we accomplished a lot. One of the things we did is we put post 9/11 surveillance under the Bush administration. It started basically right after 9/11 under a series of secret court orders. This was a major advance. These mass surveillance programs had started out as presidential authority. As authority, the president would say, we're at war with Al-Qaeda, and because of the war, we can ignore various federal laws that have been in existence since the 1970s, and they have a constitutional argument for why to do that. We ended that and put it under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. This is this secret court in Washington that approves intelligence surveillance, and briefed Congress on these programs, which they had not been briefed before, not in the kind of detail that we did, at least. So we're talking about all three branches of government having oversight of the programs. We also made some significant improvements in oversight of these programs. I personally went up on countless occasions, more than I'd like to say, got stuck in traffic on 95 in the Beltway going up to Fort Meade to look over what NSA analysts were doing and how they were following the rules or not regarding their targeting selection, regarding their minimization procedures. And as a result of those significant oversight improvements, we uncovered significant errors in the way they were conducting these programs that we had to report to the FISA court, which was angry and required us to make serious corrections. But to be honest, I think it's fair to say that we missed the broader impact of mass surveillance in the digital age on privacy. Our focus was mainly, at least my focus as a lawyer and privacy and civil liberties officer, was mainly on taking the existing approach that we had from the 1970s, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, the cases interpreting the Fourth Amendment from the Supreme Court, and making sure that our new programs were in compliance with them as much as we could do. And the reality is that the world had been transformed over those decades, and that was having a major impact on privacy. So let's look at what the results of Ed Snowden's approach were, which is to blow up the whole system with a series of massive and damaging leaks. Well, we had a revolution in transparency. And to be clear, I don't just mean the obvious transparency that when you leak information about a secret program, people know more about it. The government's response to those leaks, a lot of people don't fully understand just how significant that response was. By confirming the existence of many of those programs and then going ahead and trying to defend themselves, the Obama administration essentially opened up major NSA programs that had been classified at the TS-SCI level. That's top secret. And SCI, if you don't know what that means, then that means you'll never know. Those letters that come after, that means, okay, yeah, this is really secret. So we'll talk a little bit more about that revolution. There was an end to this major domestic bulk collection of metadata program. The Congress ended that program in 2015, roughly 2 years after the Snowden leaks, after having reauthorized it multiple times without really having a real debate about it. We'll talk a little bit more about that. That was a major, major reform. There were substantial reforms to the way that the secret court that authorizes surveillance operates. These are 11 federal judges appointed for a term of 7 years by the Chief Justice to hear surveillance applications, and they had primarily heard from government lawyers seeking permission to engage in surveillance. As a result of Ed Snowden's the revelations, there were reforms made to appoint a pool of outside lawyers called amicus curiae, friends of the court, that would argue the other side on significant issues of law. That's a major reform to the way this court works. And then I haven't even given you the most important reform, which is new rules for foreign privacy. President adopted in 2014 Presidential Policy Directive 28, PPD 28, for the very first time committing the NSA and other agencies, when they're conducting these kinds of mass signals intelligence programs, to protect the privacy not just of Americans' personal information, but of the personal information of everyone in the world. This is really a revolution in the way the intelligence community conceives of the whole concept of privacy. When I was in government, basically privacy meant Americans. If there weren't a lot of Americans in a program, somebody like me who worried about privacy, just wouldn't worry as much. Well, I guess there aren't a lot of American data in here. I can move on to this other program. So I think that when you stack up my approach and Ed Snowden's approach, it seems pretty clear that he wins. His approach was simply more effective in promoting change. And it was also a lot more damaging. So it was more damaging to national security for a variety of reasons. We can talk a little later about how the extent of that damage is actually really unknown. But what I really want to talk about or think about is there a better way to do this? Can we create a program, a system for digital mass surveillance in the 21st century that has checks and balances built into it that aren't so inadequate as they were when I found them, and that can be reformed and adapted without requiring us to just depend on, periodically, every now and then, every 10 years or 20 years, along comes a young man to, leak all the information about how surveillance works and run off to Russia or China or North Korea or someplace like that. So in order to have that conversation, I need to go back in time a little bit. I need to go back to 9/11. On 9/11, I was standing, I was working at the ACLU's Washington office, and a few short weeks after that attack, I found myself standing on the steps of the United States Capitol, handing out leaflets to members of Congress as they went to vote for something that became known as the Patriot Act. Now, this was a law that adopted some very specific and discrete changes to the way in which our surveillance laws work. And those laws had been adopted decades earlier. And really, we were trying to warn those members that they were making important changes that affected our privacy, and they didn't fully understand them. Scratch that. They didn't understand them at all. Some of the staff understood them to some degree. We had been analyzing them. But this law, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, was the main law that prohibited the government from engaging in domestic spying, spying on Americans using its giant surveillance capabilities. And what we were trying to do is get the attention of the American people that this law had been passed and just create a national debate about it and figure out things that we could do to maybe rein it in. And so we had a problem. Our problem was we didn't know how the government was using the Patriot Act. In fact, we didn't know how the government was using any of its surveillance powers. And it's kind of tautological. It's because they're secret. They're secret surveillance powers. So we imagined ways in which they might use their powers based on prior abuses, saying, well, the government passed these laws, and we've had this kind of oversight of surveillance because of things that were done that had an impact, a negative impact on civil liberties. And some of those were very serious. We know about the wiretapping of civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King. That was what the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, was set up to prevent. We also knew about something a little later called the Library Awareness Program, in which the FBI went around to various libraries and said, we think that people from the Soviet Union are using these libraries to gather information on, to recruit people to become spies for the communists. So one of the provisions of the Patriot Act we were most concerned with was a provision that said that in a counterintelligence investigation or in a terrorism investigation, the government could obtain any record, and that was it. There was no standard. But basically any record that it thought would bear on the case, would be helpful in countering terrorism. So we used the argument of, hey, they could use this to restart the Library Awareness Program, to get somebody's library records, to get their book purchasing records, kind of illustrate to the government, to the public, what the potential risks of this kind of power might be in the hands of the government. Now, at the time, the George W. Bush administration basically was trying to argue, hey, you guys are scaring people with all this talk of erosions of civil liberties. And in fact, John Ashcroft, the Attorney General at the time, said the ACLU is trying to scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty. Phantoms of lost liberty. And at the time I kind of thought, obviously this is pretty Orwellian rhetoric, although maybe rather tame by 2017 standards. But it reminded me that we were actually fighting phantoms. We didn't know what the government was doing. We didn't know if they were actually doing any of the things that we said they might be doing with their new powers. So in 2006, I had an opportunity, because of my work on the issue of intelligence reform. The government was reorganizing the intelligence community because of what the 9/11 Commission had recommended in order to better integrate foreign and domestic intelligence agencies, creating something called the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI. Most important and powerful office nobody's ever heard of. The DNI is the head of the intelligence community, and we had advocated the creation inside that office of a civil liberties and privacy office that would report directly to the head of the intelligence community to give him advice, him or her, it's always been a him, advice on protecting civil liberties and privacy. And much to my surprise, I was offered the job to be the first deputy for civil liberties in this office. And I thought kind of long and hard about, did I want to go inside the belly of the surveillance beast in the middle of the George W. Bush administration? I decided, kind of took a big gulp, decided that I would. And I found myself a few months later in the basement of a building that looks very much like this one, strapped to a chair, being asked questions by a very friendly gentleman who was running a polygraph to determine whether I might be a spy or a terrorist. And the questions went something like this. What is, is your name Tim Edgar? Yes. Are you sitting down? Yes. Okay, then let's get to the real questions. Have you associated or known any international terrorists? Yes. This was not the answer he expected. But the fact is that I'd worked with clients from the ACLU, and one of them, who'd been fighting the deportation of his brother for many years, had just been indicted as a result of surveillance that the Patriot Act had allowed the FBI to share with criminal prosecutors. Looked at me a little bit strangely, told him about what the answer was, why, we reported it. My future boss said, "Don't worry about it, Tim. He'll be delighted that he got an answer like this. It's a boring job. Finally, he found something interesting. As long as this is it, you reported it, and it was related to your work, you'll get your clearance." And I did. So that actually surprised me quite a bit in terms of our, the fairness of our security clearance system. Well, what did I learn when I went inside the surveillance state? Well, I learned that there had been a transformation in the way in which the communications infrastructure of the world was operating since the 1970s when our surveillance laws were written. This is the global traffic of telecommunications from 2010, including both telephone and internet. As you can see, this is the United States right here. It's right in the middle of everything. And this is largely because of the fiber optic cables that carry telecommunications under the oceans, under the world's oceans, which were replacing the principal means of communications before then, in the 70s, had been satellites. So when you think about the word signals intelligence, which is kind of a euphemism for mass surveillance, and I don't like euphemisms, that term comes from signals in the air. The NSA was given pretty broad authority to suck up the world's communications that were traveling over satellites from within the United States, from listening stations in the United States. For communications that were on a wire, or they're being carried by US telecommunications companies, the rule was much more restrictive. And I discovered a second thing. I discovered that this rule about collecting communications from within the United States had been violated, essentially, since 2001. Shortly after 2001, after the terrorist attacks, President George W. Bush authorized what became known as the Stellar Wind program. And the Stellar Wind program collected this kind of data, digital data of the world's communications. And it had really two major parts. It had a metadata collection, that's communications data, the routing information, when a communication is placed, when a phone call is placed, or when an email is sent, but not the content of the phone call or the email. The parties to the call, when it happens, other information like that, but not the content. That's collected in bulk under Stellar Wind. And then the second group of Stellar Wind was the content, and that was based on, at the time, a decision by an NSA analyst that the target was reasonably suspected of belonging to Al-Qaeda, based on a theory that the government had that the president could basically trump these laws that Congress had passed because of the need to fight Al-Qaeda and the war on terror. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, the president's commander-in-chief needs to have the ability to surveil the enemy. And that's the programs I talked about, which we worked very hard to put under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court during the time that I was in government. Well, in 2008, along comes President Obama. And he offers us a new approach to the war on terror, counterterrorism, including NSA surveillance programs. One of Obama's key campaign promises was to review all of the programs the Bush administration had conducted to see whether or not they could be changed to better protect privacy. But importantly, I think a lot of people forget this, in 2008, he also voted for a law that allowed many of these programs to continue. The monitoring of people overseas whose communications were transiting or were inside the United States, including communications between foreign targets and people in the United States. And this was actually one of the more controversial things he did in the campaign among his own supporters. But it goes to show you where his thinking is, which is not necessarily against surveillance, but looking for surveillance to happen within a framework of checks and balances, and within a framework of 3 branches of government. Now, importantly, despite this discussion about surveillance in 2008 under what's called the FISA Amendments Act, the bulk collection of metadata is still very much a secret. So only part of the Stellar Wind program became public at this time, relatively small part of the program. And this larger metadata collection part remains secret. So over the next few years, essentially, Congress is continuing to receive briefings on these surveillance programs. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is continuing to authorize them and to address compliance problems that we're telling them about. But some of the critics of the programs in Congress are getting a little restless, a little restive, saying, you know, the public really doesn't understand the scale of what the NSA is doing. And in particular, they don't understand that there's a program of bulk collection of telephone metadata ongoing involving massive quantities of data being collected about domestic telephone calls. So that brings us to the spring of 2013. And my old boss's boss, Jim Clapper's the worst moment probably in his life. His least untruthful answer in a congressional hearing. So along comes Senator Ron Wyden, who's been briefed fully on these programs, along with every other member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and he asks him an extremely pointed question. Does the NSA collect records on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? This is kind of, this is one of those questions where if you think about when you're a good lawyer and you're cross-examining a witness, you never, never, never ask them a question you don't already know the answer to. That recommendation comes from, as unimpeachable a source I can imagine, Atticus Finch, although I suppose he's been tarnished by the second book. But I don't know if that's really canon. Anyway, in To Kill a Mockingbird, Atticus Finch says, you never, never ask a question of a witness you don't know the answer to. And the answer, of course, is yes, we have bulk collection of metadata. That's what Wyden is thinking about. Now, Clapper at this point has several options. And I want to explore those each in a little bit of depth here. First of all, it's important to understand this is not sprung on him. He's had this question for 24 hours, although to be fair to him, he says he didn't focus on it. Now, there are 2 duties that Clapper has to contend with here. The first is the obvious one, the one you're all thinking of in your head. He's a sworn witness. He has the obligation to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But he's also the head of the intelligence community. And under federal law, he has a personal obligation to protect the sources and methods of the intelligence community. So responding with the whole truth, if the whole truth is classified information that he personally believes is going to blow a source or a method, is going to put him in violation of that duty. Now, there's an easy way out of this. You know, my good friend Bob Litt, the lawyer for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, it's his job to advise General Clapper on his duties. You can whisper into his ear and say, you know, the courts have approved, I neither confirm nor deny that the NSA collects records on hundreds of millions of Americans. You could say that. That solves your problem. Well, except for the fact that I think we all know what the answer is when somebody says that. So I can neither confirm nor deny doesn't really work very well as a way of denying anything. He could say, you know, the answer is yes, Senator Wyden, and I've decided to declassify the existence of this huge metadata bulk collection program. Or he can do what he did, which is to lie. Or at least to say something false, whether he lied or not is a question of intent. No, sir, not wittingly. He's given several explanations for his answer. I think that I really don't have an opinion as to whether any of those are truthful or not. I do actually think that it is sometimes quite complicated to figure out what somebody is talking about. I already just confused the heck out of all you with metadata and content. If he's thinking of content, this is a truthful answer. If he's thinking of metadata, this is a false answer. Well, we don't have to wait very long to find out what the true answer is in terms of the American people, because within just a couple of months of this testimony, we find out from Ed Snowden what the answer is, which is that, yes, we scan. It turns out that, yes, the NSA has launched a series of programs, not just this telephone metadata program we've been talking about in some detail, but some other big programs that involve what I call in the book mass surveillance. And I want to be a little clear about my terminology here. That's not a legal term. That's not a technical term that has a particular definition. That's my way of describing just how frightening these programs could be to our privacy. When you're talking about large-scale collection of data and communications of a large number of people all over the world. So that also includes internet surveillance, programs called Upstream Collection and PRISM. These are under, you may hear something about Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That is the law that Obama voted for in 2008, allowing the NSA to collect data on foreign targets from within the United States. So the data is inside the United States, but the targets, the accounts, the users of the accounts are outside the United States. And then a large variety of programs to undermine the security of communications, which in some ways were a big shock, and in other ways were completely predictable, because this is entirely the purpose of the NSA and has been since it was founded and even before it was founded, which is to undermine the security of communications in order to gather intelligence. And this is simply the internet or digital version of that mission. But most of those techniques, highly unregulated, not regulated by federal law at all, but merely by an executive order called Executive Order 12333, which governs much of what the NSA does overseas, where they don't have to worry about pesky courts, even secret pesky courts. Now, the thing that's a little surprising about these revelations is not so much the fact that there was a leak that was embarrassing to the government. That happens from time to time, but the government's response. Over the next several months, rather than simply saying no comment, we don't comment on classified leaks, which is the typical response, they found they couldn't get away with that. This was simply too massive, a series of leaks. People that were too important, allies and the tech community, were affected, and so the government did something a little bit uncharacteristic. It launched a massive transparency drive. And that transparency drive was led by none other than Jim Clapper. Created a website called I See on the Record, a Tumblr, which is somewhat surprising to those of you who are aware of Tumblr. Thousands of pages of documents that had been classified at the highest levels were released on this Tumblr with, in some cases, relatively minimal redactions, in other cases, more significant redactions. Much of them opinions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court or other rules designed to protect privacy. The idea here is to put into perspective some of these programs. Okay, it's true. Yes, we scan, but people like Tim Edgar are out there trying to protect us with a bunch of rules to protect us against the scanning being misused. Now, something that's fascinating to me about this, which is not well known, is that if you look at simply sheer volume of release of information, this is, by 2014, was well over double the number of documents that Snowden had taken and published. He didn't publish them. The journalists he worked with published them. Just in terms of volume of pages of documents I see on the record, and these were pretty dynamite documents, was actually double. And so some of these revelations that we think of as Snowden revelations, some of them at least ought to be called Clapper revelations, because they were the result of Clapper's transparency drive. Another significant develop here was the annual Intelligence Transparency Report. Offers us significant detail, which the government had for decades argued was highly classified, on things like the number of targets that are under surveillance at any given time. So the government had released the number of court orders by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, but had resisted releasing the number of actual targets of people under surveillance. And to give you some idea as to why that's important, under traditional Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act orders, like the kind that were being used to prevent wiretapping of civil rights leaders, to focus that on suspected spies and terrorists in the United States, that's usually one, maybe a couple of people in a particular order. But under this new 702 program, under upstream collection and PRISM, there's only one Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court order, and the last transparency report said that under that one order there were over 100,000 targets. So it's kind of important to understand, if you want to understand the scale of surveillance, to understand the number of targets and not just the number of orders issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. But the reforms didn't stop with transparency. They included some privacy reforms, including the USA Freedom Act, which helped to reform this practice of bulk collection inside the United States. Now, I really like this NSA seal. This is not the official seal. This is actually a T-shirt you can get from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a civil liberties group. I always think actually that, you know, it's a little bit, kind of makes the NSA look a little cool to me. I'm not sure there's always a double-edged sword to arguing that someone has all your data. Well, why do I say that these reforms strengthened intelligence? Well, when it came to bulk collection of telephone metadata, you know, we had gone up there. I actually, you know, made some mistakes here myself. I had gone up to NSA on many occasions to review how these programs worked and to see if privacy rules were being followed. But when it came to the effectiveness of the programs, I kind of felt like, well, I would take at face value essentially what the NSA analysts and leadership told me about the use of this information. And so I knew that the bulk metadata collection program had been used in half a dozen terrorist incidents, terrorist investigations. It would be overstating it to say that it had thwarted half a dozen terrorist attacks, but certainly that seemed like that was kind of self-evidently evidence of value. Well, within a year or two after the Snowden revelations, a important little-known oversight body called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board conducted its own deep dive into each of those cases. And what they found was that at least for this particular program, there was no unique value in the data that was being collected. This was a major finding, a big, big deal. Because what it said is this program that was set up after 9/11 to collect billions of records, analyze them in order to uncover patterns of terrorist communications, yeah, it had been used in several terrorist investigations, but the government could get the data easily from other sources, and in fact did get the data easily from other sources, and therefore did not provide the value that we had thought it was providing. This finding was a major factor, I would say, in Congress choosing to end that program in 2015 when this power came up for renewal and Congress chose to end it. But the story doesn't stop there. It turns out that ending the bulk collection program actually gave NSA analysts access to more rather than less relevant data. And that's not only because, well, you've got a big database and now we have less data to worry about. It's also because when you have a bulk collection program that's highly secret, then for reasons of trust and also logistics, you have to limit that to a few large telecommunications companies and telecommunications providers. Under a more transparent and open Freedom Act system, where you're not collecting all the data and where it's not so secret that you end up making the intelligence, head of the intelligence committee squirm and in the witness seat when you ask him about it, you can have a lot more providers participating. And so the NSA said within about 6 months of this transition, you know, we have substantially more data, access to substantially more data under the new system than we had under the old system. We're not collecting the volume, but in terms of what our analysts need, we actually have more records that are relevant. So it actually strengthened intelligence rather than weakening it. We also talked about reforming the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. I like this image of the FISA court because it kind of subverts the typical courtroom sketch. This is a courtroom door sketch in which you get to see the locked door of the FISA court on the Federal District Courthouse in Washington, D.C. And that's all you get to see because that's all anyone gets to see unless you're a cleared lawyer with a top secret clearance and you go into that cleared room. But it had only ever really heard from the government in the past. With the Freedom Act, it created a pool of lawyers whose job is to argue for privacy, or at least to give a different perspective on the legal issues than what the Justice Department lawyers are given. The Freedom Act says that these should be appointed in any case involving a significant interpretation of law. The judges still have a fair amount of discretion in how they use these amici, so they're not quite an adversarial system, but it's a significant improvement to the way in which we would do legal argument. Now, I think there are other reforms that we need to make of the FISA court, and my biggest recommendation here is to use technologists. And what I mean by that is, actually this was also in some ways a result of Snowden, although it was also because of concerns around cybersecurity, but a number of civil liberties organizations have in recent years been hiring computer scientists and technologists, including the ACLU, EFF, other privacy groups. And the reason is these are very complex issues and they need an expert look. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court has a small pool of staff attorneys that assist federal judges. They're depending almost entirely for their technical information, not even on technologists directly, but on Justice Department lawyers who are working with technologists and agencies like the NSA. So it's not surprising that they may not know the right questions to ask, and that problems persist sometimes for years before they're discovered within the agencies. If you had staff technologists at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, something that you might call a special master, that's a legal term, this would give that kind of oversight much more teeth. And then finally, in terms of the reforms from Snowden, we had a real sea change in the definition of what privacy is. As I said, privacy had always been seen as Americans. What are you, only Americans are protected by the Fourth Amendment. We're worried about agencies of the US government engaging in domestic spying for political purposes. Spying on people overseas, well, that's their job. We don't worry about the privacy of foreigners. But that's changed since the Snowden revelations, and that's because of Presidential Policy Directive 28. Now, you might ask, well, why would the US government care about foreign privacy? Foreigners don't vote. And the answer has a lot to do with the tech community. This is a meeting that President Obama is having with technology CEOs in December of 2013. And although it wasn't on the official agenda, all the tech CEOs wanted to talk about was Snowden. And the reason they wanted to talk about the NSA is that they were suffering a real danger of lost business. Forrester Research had suggested, had estimated that the Snowden effect, what they called the Snowden effect, could cause American technology companies that store data from around the world tens of billions of dollars in lost business, and possibly up to $100 billion, because foreign customers would migrate to their own foreign companies instead of trusting Google and Amazon and other American companies. And so when President Obama and other members of the administration came out and talked about the privacy rules that protected US persons, as we call them, Americans, says the citizens or residents, the tech CEO said, this isn't helping us. In fact, it's actually hurting us, because when you keep on talking about all your great privacy protections for Americans, you're just sending the message to the rest of the world that you don't matter. So along comes Presidential Policy Directive 28. And there are some detailed rules. The principal detailed rule is that information about foreign persons should be treated for retention and minimization purposes basically the same as US persons. But it also has some significant aspirational language talking about how all persons should be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their nationality or wherever they might reside, and all persons have legitimate privacy interests in the handling of their personal information. This really is a revolutionary concept for the intelligence community. The idea that privacy is a human right that is universal and belongs to everyone in the world. Now, does that mean that we're going to apply the Fourth Amendment to everyone in the world? No. What does it actually mean to treat foreigners with dignity and respect? Well, but still, just having a debate about now what should the level of protection be rather than is there a level at all was a significant sea change. Now, one way in which we fell short, and I think we need a lot more work on reforming the way intelligence is collected and handled, is on the use of technology in order to minimize the impact on privacy of surveillance programs. There are what I call technological magic. And there's one of the magicians right there. Another one is Seni Kamara from Brown, a real pioneer in the area of encrypted search. And the reason this is such a disappointment to me personally is that I actually worked on this for many years inside the government. And we funded significant amount of research in these areas. I'll give you an example. Encrypted search is the idea of searching a very large database in a way that the holder of the database doesn't know what you're searching. And you don't know anything about the database except the information that you're authorized to retrieve. Now, without technology, you need some kind of trusted third party to make that happen. But with technology and the use of encryption, and not just standard encryption, but cryptographic techniques, you can figure out ways to extract information from a large database that has these privacy guarantees for both parties. This could be an extremely useful technique for the NSA and other holders of massive amounts of data that would allow them to get the kind of data that we as a society choose to allow them to have with guarantees that they're not doing anything that we don't want them to do, and without having to have the data collected in bulk. Seni Kamara at Brown has done a tremendous amount of work in this area, and your own Ed Felton has actually done a lot of work in figuring out how these and other techniques could be used to reform specific NSA programs. And my view is that we need to do a lot more with technological magic. And by the way, the title of this chapter in my book is a little bit of a diss, well, it's a lot of a diss, on a report that was issued after Snowden, basically, which I was disappointed in on the potential use of these techniques, which used this phrase somewhat disparagingly. Now, why do we care about mass surveillance? And what is the prospect that the kinds of capabilities that Ed Snowden disclosed beginning in 2013 might be abused? I think the danger of abuse is actually very high. I think the danger of abuse of these global mass surveillance capabilities is higher now than it has probably been at any time since Richard Nixon, since the 1970s, and the birth of our modern oversight system. And I think there are two dangers here. The first danger is an obvious one. We have a president in President Trump who has actually promised to engage in a number of very alarming policies that do not have much, if any, respect for constitutional liberties and constitutional rights, especially of Muslim Americans. Now, he said a lot in the campaign, a lot of things about building a wall, I remember, you might as well, creating a registry of Muslims, a travel ban on Muslims. He also, and you probably don't know this, endorsed warrantless searches of Muslims and endorsed surveillance programs directed at Muslims. These were part and parcel of a general attitude that seemed to show little respect for basic constitutional rights. And when you think about the legal theories available to Donald Trump, going back to the George W. Bush years, those opinions saying that the president has power in the war on terror to disregard certain aspects of federal law, they're still pretty much on the books. They're still available for a clever lawyer in the executive branch, such as Stephen Miller, to dust off and say, you know, forget about all this oversight and all these complicated rules that Congress came up with. We're going to use our executive authority in the war on terror, and we're going to direct it at particular people, potentially even including people inside the United States. But that's not the only danger of abuse. That's not the only possibility. I think this is, you know, this is one of these areas where, you know, we all sort of are hoping that they don't get their act together. And I think that's actually a fairly significant hope. The other danger is weakness. So this is kind of a danger of strength, or strongman tendencies, as I call it. There's also a danger in weakness. What else has Donald Trump said about surveillance? Terrible. Just found out Obama had my wires tapped in the campaign when I was in Trump Tower. Now, this tweet essentially was designed to distract us from an investigation involving the Russians. Ironically, in defense of that tweet, the White House spokesman at the time, Sean Spicer, went off on a 10-minute explanation of all of the ways in which we can be surveilled without having to get a FISA court order, which I thought was just a wonderful sort of check-the-box, you know, issue-spotting exercise for my surveillance reform book. Yeah, every one of them was true. But I think there are two ways in which this points out a potential danger of abuse. The first is that, of course, it's a little disturbing that the president doesn't know that you can't actually do that the president of the United States doesn't have the power to order a surveillance operation like that. But more, it's the fighting that's going on, the tension that's going on between the White House and the intelligence community, which in the past, and I'm speaking particularly of the Richard Nixon era here, has resulted in some of the worst surveillance abuses in American history. And that's because you end up essentially with these two powerful organizations at war with each other. We've already had significant surveillance abuses used by people inside the intelligence community leaking information from surveillance in order to damage Trump officials. As much as I dislike many of the officials and was happy to see them damaged, this was a violation of basic Fourth Amendment principles. When you surveil somebody who's a valid foreign target and you acquire information about their communications with Americans, that has to be treated in accordance with very strict minimization rules. This is not just a typical leak of classified information. This is a leak of surveillance information which has constitutional implications. But ironically, another serious danger of abuse here is in an overreaction to those leaks. Looking to try to uncover the leakers has been in the past a potential source of abuse. So all of this instability, all of this potential danger, I think just highlights what we need to do, which is to not be complacent about the issue of digital mass surveillance. And what can we do about it? How can we lessen this danger? Well, you can buy my book. But I have a series of detailed recommendations at the end, which is really designed to illustrate how we've, since Snowden, we've had these significant steps, these important first steps towards reforming our surveillance system to address the issues of the digital age. And I think that's not that well known, but these are only the first steps. We need to go much, much further if we're going to make these kinds of capabilities safe for use by a democracy. And I talk about ways in which we can increase substantially the transparency we have, even beyond what we've already done. We've made tactical changes. The intelligence community has sort of tactically increased transparency in order to try to justify their programs. There are many, many ways in which that transparency needs to be deepened. We need to have laws and not just policy directives that respect the privacy of everyone in the world. Currently, Congress is debating whether to reauthorize Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And I have to say that I've been disappointed in that debate. That debate has focused, it's kind of old school. It's focused on, well, okay, so you can use these powers inside the country to get foreign targets. We're fine with that, but what can we do to better protect the privacy of Americans whose communications are incidentally collected? And my sense is that this is a losing battle, that trying to protect the privacy of Americans while leaving the privacy of everyone else unprotected just doesn't work in the digital age. And so I've been disappointed to see Congress putting most of its attention on that. And I think we need to have a much broader understanding of privacy, and that needs to be in our laws. And then we need to use technological magic to allow us to have the advantages of many of these digital mass surveillance programs without such a serious impact on privacy. So thank you very much. So questions? Sure.
Yeah. Regarding the privacy of foreigners, how much did the revelation of the tapping of Angela Merkel's phone impact this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, in one respect, and I guess since we're streaming here, I need to be a little careful here. The widespread reports of the tapping of Angela Merkel's phone illustrate the basic point that people can, that friends sometimes spy on friends. And that when you're talking about government officials, of course, who would be a better target than the head of a major government of the world? So, in one respect, in terms of abuse, you know, there's nothing. This is the kind of thing we would expect in terms of intelligence gathering. But in a broader sense, it had a big impact because it raised in the minds of one of America's closest allies, the German government and the German people, you know, real anger and real dismay over what the Americans had been doing, according to the German press. And so, you know, with Merkel, with Dilma Rousseff, and other U.S. allies putting pressure on the United States and saying we need to have some way of reassuring our populations that cooperation with the Americans in intelligence gathering isn't just, you know, open season on the privacy of our people, I think had a serious impact on encouraging reforms like PPD 28. Ultimately, there was a debate after Snowden about whether his disclosures, the harm that his disclosures caused to national security, was outweighed by the benefit to the public of the reforms that followed. And one of the ways in which the two camps, those who argued, no, the harm was greater, were arguing against those who argued more like me, well, the benefits were more significant, had to do with how you define the public. The basic argument against Snowden was, yes, well, he did reveal this bulk collection program involving telephone metadata, but that was just one program, and there were so many others he revealed that involved legitimate spying on foreigners. And how can you justify that? And I think that the thing that was interesting to me about that debate is that the NSA is not actually neutral on that, and they come down on the cosmopolitan side because they have to. They depend on foreign partners to gather intelligence. And so if foreign governments that are democratic governments, which are among our closest allies, if their populations lose trust in the United States, that's going to damage that relationship. And so, unlike members of Congress who may have the luxury of saying, I don't really care what people in Germany think about the NSA, I only care about what people in my district think, the NSA actually does have to care what people in Germany think about it. So I do think that had a significant impact on those revelations. Yeah?
You said a clever lawyer in the Trump White House like Stephen Miller could figure out a way to circumvent the restrictions on surveillance.
Yeah.
So would we know if, in fact, that had already happened?
Well, that's a good question, and it has a lot to do with leaks. You know, I think that my good colleague Jack Goldsmith up at Harvard has written a lot about this issue of what is the danger of Trump and what is the damage that Trump has done to our national security and to our national security institutions. And one of the points he makes is that there are many checks on the president's authority that aren't, you know, what you learn about in third grade, the checks and balances of Congress and the Supreme Court. And one of those involves whistleblowing or leaking, whether justified or unjustified. So I think on a very pragmatic level, we probably would find out about it if the circle was drawn wide enough to make those programs actually work. There's going to be somebody who chooses to leak it, because that would create sort of a firestorm of disagreement on the heart of anyone in the intelligence community who was thinking, gosh, I've seen this movie before, and I don't want this happening again. General Hayden, who was the director of the CIA and also the director of the NSA, during the transition period when there was discussion of would the CIA resume waterboarding, said, you know, if they want to waterboard, they better bring their own bucket because CIA officers aren't going to do it. And the point was, you know, they've seen it before where they do something with a legal opinion that says that what they do is legal, and then, you know, the political folks move on and they're still there in the agency carrying the water for the policies that were made. So I think that's probably true, but I wouldn't say it's 100% guarantee. And it's certainly not any kind of comfort that, you know, this is kind of part of what I was beginning with at the beginning of the talk, which is that I don't think this is a good way to have checks and balances, to be relying on someone to leak classified information in ways that could be quite damaging to national security. And so we need to have better checks and balances. Yeah, you had your hand up.
So you say that we're still needing to have more transparency in the way that this information is shared with the American public. In what ways, since the Snowden revelations, have we still managed to fall short?
Great question. I'd say that we haven't made enough, we haven't thought deeply enough about how the culture of secrecy is embedded in both in the culture of our intelligence community and in our legal framework. One thing is that the incentives towards overclassification are still heavily weighted towards classifying information and not towards transparency. When I was in the government, you know, I had a computer like this one, and the difference was that at the top of the menu bar, along with, you know, commands to save the file and so forth, there was a command that said classify. And you clicked at that menu bar and you went down, and there was a whole bunch of markings you could click on to select particular reasons for classifying information. And it generates all the markings that you need for your document. Now, if I was a little bit too quick to click that and classify that information, you know, the consequences were basically nothing to me. I mean, it was, maybe there's a bit of a hassle in terms of figuring out how to downgrade the overclassified document if I have to share it with another agency. Maybe my document will have to be downgraded when somebody decides to get it under a FOIA request. But if I underclassify, I've just mishandled classified information, and that could have serious consequences for my security clearance in my career. So that's an example of how, and that's still there. Those incentives for overclassification are there. If anything, they're greater now, given the results of the last election. You know, we all saw how Senator Hillary Clinton, Secretary Clinton, was treated for her decision to kind of go outside the system of bureaucratic use of email in ways that, you know, essentially cost her the election. In terms of legal issues, there are a whole variety of legal doctrines which heavily reinforce government secrecy. They are the state secrets doctrine, which allows the government to basically dismiss a lawsuit by saying, litigating this case, we can't even decide this case because we would have to talk about too much classified information, so that makes the case go away. Standing, which says you have to be injured, you have to show that you've been injured before you can even get into court. And so secrecy really helps if you're the government and you don't want someone to show that they've been injured. None of those have changed either. So the transparency is primarily kind of a short-term tactical reaction to Snowden to say we're going to come clean and we're going to show our work to the public, and that's been beneficial. But I think there's a real danger that we might go back into bad habits. Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts are about the future of privacy and surveillance outside of the NSA and other parts of the government. And I'm thinking about two things in particular that, to me at least, seem sort of ominous. The first being the Obama administration's executive order right at the end of his term to allow the NSA to share bulk communications data with various other agencies without any sort of filtering or culling. And then second, some of those agencies' sort of archaic views on privacy, thinking specifically about the FBI with its scandal over encryption with Apple,
Sure.
and then DHS's move toward wanting to require all visitors to the U.S. to hand over their social media credentials.
Okay, so those are three great big topics. Good. I was just wondering if you want to
Give this answer.
Okay. Okay. So won't be quite as full as all three of those because they're very interesting. I'll try to take them in reverse order. Yeah, this is, I think, a huge disaster, this DHS policy of basically putting us, on record as saying you have to give up all your digital privacy when you cross the border. I actually think it's quite likely that's going to get struck down because of the Riley v. California case involving cell phone privacy. I think DHS is taking this kind of, view that because there's an exception to searching in order to enforce our customs laws at the border, this gives them sort of carte blanche to go into all this digital data. And I think that's the same kind of error in logic that led the police to think they could search your cell phone because they have an exception normally that says they can search you when they arrest you by making sure you don't have a weapon or evidence of a crime. So this is basically the same exact error in logic, and the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 against the police in Riley v. California. I think it's going to be tough for DHS to ultimately prevail on that, I hope, anyway. On the issue of the FBI and encryption, this is just an example of sort of a failure to communicate between lawyers and technologists. I think that there are differing views of what privacy is that come from our professional training and our understanding of what privacy is. And I think that we've heard from technologists for quite a long time now that having a weakness built into a communications platform makes that communications platform weaker, and that it's not really possible to have a weakness that only the good guys use, that only our guys use, and that no one else can exploit. And I just think that's a basic fact about the way the universe works. And there's not, however many, tomorrow there's another one of umpteen million going dark conferences that's being held at the Naval Academy, which I may or may not be able to make it down to. But you're not going to be able to solve that problem. And then your first question, I think, was about
Just what you think that means in terms. So you're fairly optimistic about the NSA, obviously, or it seems like.
Well, yes, about the information sharing procedures in 2000. So just to give you guys the sort of headline here, this was an information sharing idea that took almost the entire Obama administration to implement. And yes, I think there's a real concern here, which is that the NSA has this large amounts of data, and they have a culture of applying pretty strict rules to that data because they know essentially that they're a little bit pregnant with how much data they have. So they're skittish about it in a way that other agencies often aren't. The FBI and others, they don't think I have this giant database and I need to be careful about how I use it. They tend to think the opposite way of, if I've collected something, now I'm allowed to use it. And they're much more concerned about the collection phase. By by opening up those large databases to information sharing among other agencies, which is what those procedures do, I do think there's a real danger, again, of potential abuse of those programs. And I would say that's just one of those reasons we need to do more to reform mass surveillance generally.
Right, thanks very much.
Thank you.